Eating insects is the most normal thing humans have ever done, and you are currently living in the brief, bizarre historical exception where we decided it was disgusting. That revulsion you feel when you imagine a beetle on your plate is not biology, it is not evolution, and it is certainly not universal. It is a cultural artifact as specific and as temporary as powdered wigs or foot binding, built by accident, reinforced by empire, and now quietly collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. The paradox is this: for 2 million years, every single one of your ancestors ate bugs without hesitation. And yet you, sitting in a climate-controlled room surrounded by more processed food than any pharaoh could have imagined, cannot stomach the very protein that built your brain. I'm going to show you exactly how that happened, who profited from making you feel sick, and why the feeling is already starting to fade. But first, you have to unlearn the story you were told about why we stopped. The standard narrative goes like this: humans were primitive bug eaters until we invented agriculture and domesticated animals, at which point we graduated to superior foods and left the creepy crawlies behind in the dirt where they belong. It is a clean line of progress, a ladder from savagery to civilization, and it is completely wrong. Agriculture did not replace entomophagy. For thousands of years, farming and bug eating existed side by side, intertwined so deeply that you cannot separate them. The shift away from insects was not a technological upgrade. It was a social negotiation, a series of political decisions, religious edicts, and economic accidents that had almost nothing to do with nutrition and everything to do with power. The real question is not why ancient people ate bugs, because that requires no explanation whatsoever. The real question is what specific sequence of events convinced billions of modern humans that the most abundant, efficient, and historically validated source of animal protein on Earth had suddenly become inedible. And the answer begins not in a cave, but in a cathedral. To understand what we lost, you have to understand just how sophisticated the relationship between humans and insects actually was before the break. We tend to imagine prehistoric bug eating as desperate scavenging, a grim fallback when the mammoth didn't show up. But the archaeological record tells a radically different story. At Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, researchers found pollen clusters from medicinal plants mixed with insect remains dating back 60,000 years, suggesting that Neanderthals were not just grabbing whatever crawled past, but were selectively harvesting specific species for both food and pharmacology. They had no word for entomophagy, no concept of nutritional science, no written language to pass down recipes. But they were doing it anyway, with intention and precision that would make a modern forager nod in recognition. This was not survival, it was cuisine. Move forward 40,000 years to the Guitarrero Cave in Peru, where archaeologists uncovered coprolites, fossilized feces if you want the technical term, that contained identifiable fragments of beetles, caterpillars, and ants alongside maize and beans. These were not emergency rations consumed during famine. They were part of a stable, diversified diet in a society that was already practicing early horticulture. The people in that cave were farmers who also ate bugs, not because they had to, but because they understood something we have forgotten: that insects are not a replacement for plant agriculture, but a complement to it, a way of converting waste biomass into dense protein without competing for arable land. A handful of dried larvae in a pot of grain porridge doesn't just add calories, it adds lysine, an essential amino acid that grains lack, turning a marginal meal into a complete one. Ancient cooks figured this out through millennia of trial and error, long before anyone isolated an amino acid in a lab. They had no biochemistry textbooks, but their bodies knew the math. In central Mexico, the Aztec Empire ran on insects, with a level of industrial organization that rivals modern livestock production. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the Spanish conquistadors who marched into Tenochtitlan in 1519, wrote extensively about the markets there, and his accounts read less like descriptions of a primitive society and more like inventory lists from a gourmet food hall. He documented stalls selling toasted grasshoppers called chapulines, ant eggs known as escamoles, agave worms, waterflies, and dozens of other species, each prepared differently, each with its own season, its own price point, its own culinary reputation. Escamoles, the larvae of the Lyometopum ant, were harvested from the roots of agave plants in a process so delicate and labor-intensive that it commanded prices higher than meat. Today, escamoles still sell for upwards of $50 per kilogram in Mexican markets, sometimes called insect caviar. But by the time Diaz del Castillo wrote his memoirs, decades after the conquest, he had already begun reframing these delicacies as evidence of barbarism rather than sophistication. The same man who marveled at Aztec engineering and astronomy needed the food to be disgusting so that the conquest could be righteous. You cannot admire a cuisine and destroy its culture simultaneously. One has to give, and in this case, the palate was sacrificed to justify the sword. This brings us to the mechanism of disgust itself, which is where the story gets genuinely strange. Disgust is not a reflex. It is a learned behavior. And like all learned behaviors, it can be taught, enforced, and weaponized. Anthropologists have documented this in real time across multiple cultures. In Thailand, children raised in rural villages eat fried crickets and silkworm pupae with evident pleasure until they enter urban schools, where teachers and peers signal that these foods are backward, poor, and shameful. Within a generation, the same children who once begged for insect snacks refused to touch them, not because their taste buds changed, but because their social identity did. The disgust arrives from outside, carried by language, by media, by the subtle curriculum of what counts as respectable. In the colonial context, this process was accelerated and formalized. European administrators in Africa and Asia didn't just express personal distaste for local insect foods. They actively suppressed them as part of civilizing missions, replacing indigenous protein sources with imported livestock and grain monocultures that served metropolitan markets rather than local nutrition. A missionary in 19th century Congo reported banning caterpillar harvesting among converts, framing it as pagan practice incompatible with Christian morality. The caterpillars were nutritionally superior to anything the mission could provide, but superiority was irrelevant. The goal was not health, it was conformity. And here's where the resistance gets truly absurd. Because the institutions enforcing this taboo were often contradicting their own foundational texts while doing so. Leviticus 11:22 explicitly permits the eating of locusts, katydids, and crickets, listing them by name as clean foods. John the Baptist survived in the wilderness on locusts and wild honey, a diet presented in Scripture as holy asceticism rather than deprivation. Yet medieval and early modern European theologians spent enormous energy arguing that insects were unclean, that they bred from rotting matter through spontaneous generation, that consuming them was tantamount to consuming decay itself. Aristotle had claimed that insects arose from mud and dung without parents, a biological error that persisted for nearly 2,000 years and transformed insects from animals into manifestations of corruption. If a creature has no mother, if it emerges from filth by some dark alchemy, then eating it is not nourishment but contamination. This was bad science dressed up as divine law, and it stuck so thoroughly that even after Francesco Redi disproved spontaneous generation in 1668, with elegant experiments showing that maggots only appeared on meat when flies could lay eggs, the emotional association between insects and uncleanness refused to die. Science corrected the fact, culture kept the feeling. The obsession with purity merged with the rise of industrial agriculture in ways that made insect consumption structurally impossible, rather than merely culturally disfavored. When you farm at scale, uniformity becomes the highest virtue. A field of identical wheat maturing simultaneously can be harvested by machine. A landscape teeming with diverse insect populations cannot. Pesticides were developed not just to protect crops, but to simplify ecosystems, to render fields legible to capital and machinery. Every insect killed by DDT was also a potential food source erased from the landscape. And as chemical inputs intensified through the 20th century, the insects that survived became toxic liabilities rather than nutritional assets. You cannot harvest grasshoppers from a field sprayed with organophosphates and expect anyone to eat them safely. The Green Revolution didn't just increase yields, it severed the relationship between farming and foraging that had sustained human populations for millennia. A farmer in Kansas in 1950 might still remember eating cicadas as a child, but his grandchildren would grow up in a world where insects meant crop damage, pesticide residue, and failure. The abundance hadn't disappeared, it had been poisoned. Now let me introduce you to the person who tried to reverse this single-handedly, because every story about forbidden food needs its obsessive prophet, and Vincent Holt was magnificently unhinged. In 1885, this British entomologist published a book titled, "Why Not Eat Insects?" And it reads like the manifesto of a man who has stared too long into the abyss of public indifference and decided to scream. Holt did not argue from nutrition or sustainability or global hunger. Those frameworks barely existed yet. He argued from gastronomy, from national pride, from sheer contrarian delight. He provided recipes for moth larvae in cream sauce, for beetle grubs fried in breadcrumbs, for slug soup. He included slugs, which are not insects, because his enthusiasm outran his taxonomy. He described the flavor of wood-boring beetle larvae as resembling almonds, and insisted that English gentlemen were depriving themselves of pleasures that French peasants enjoyed regularly. He lectured at scientific societies, wrote letters to newspapers, badgered restaurant owners, and generally made himself insufferable in the service of a cause that nobody wanted. Holt failed spectacularly, of course. Victorian England was precisely the wrong audience at precisely the wrong moment, steeped in imperial confidence and industrial certainty, convinced that progress moved in straight lines away from anything crawling. But his failure was instructive, because it revealed that the barrier was never rational. You cannot logic someone out of a disgust they never reasoned themselves into. Holt offered facts. His audience felt nausea. The gap between those two things is where the entire history of entomophagy lives. And yet, reading his book today, you sense something else beneath the eccentricity, a genuine grief for a lost vocabulary of taste, a mourning for flavors that his society had decided to forget. He was wrong about the timing, wrong about the audience, wrong about the slugs, but he was right about the loss. Sit with that for a second. A man spending his life trying to give back a pleasure that everyone around him had agreed to abandon, not because it was harmful, but because it was inconvenient to the story they wanted to tell about themselves. The cost of that story was paid by people whose names we do not know, in places where the cameras were not pointed. During the famines that swept colonial India in the late 19th century, British administrators documented starving populations, refusing to eat certain insects, because caste restrictions and colonial-era reclassification had rendered them socially unacceptable, even as grain exports continued to London. The insects were present. The permission to consume them was not. In southern Africa, Mopane worm harvesting had sustained communities through seasonal lean periods for centuries, providing reliable protein when crops failed and game was scarce. Colonial Forestry Services declared Mopane forests state property, regulated harvesting, imposed taxes, and disrupted the communal management systems that had kept the resource sustainable. The worms didn't vanish. Access to them did. People starved not because nature failed, but because bureaucracy succeeded. The famine was ecological only in appearance. In structure, it was administrative. A woman standing in a Mopane grove she was no longer allowed to harvest was experiencing the endpoint of a chain of decisions made in offices she would never see, by men who had never tasted the food they were forbidding. The disgust was manufactured in Westminster. The hunger was felt in Limpopo. That distance is not incidental. It is the entire point. This is the channel's recurring reminder before we reach the darkness. Every food taboo is a technology of control, and the ones that feel most natural are usually the ones that were engineered most deliberately. Your gag reflex is not yours alone. It is inherited infrastructure, maintained by systems that benefit from your compliance. Recognizing this does not make the disgust disappear. You cannot think your way out of a feeling wired in childhood. But it does create space between the sensation and the judgment, between the body's reaction and the mind's endorsement. That space is where change happens, slowly, uncomfortably, one awkward dinner party at a time. The darkness, when it comes, is quiet. It is not a massacre or a plague. It is a silence. In the American Southwest, native communities that had harvested piñon nuts and yucca moths and agave grubs for thousands of years were relocated onto reservations, where traditional foraging grounds were fenced, paved, or converted to ranch land. Government-issued commodity foods replaced wild harvests: white flour, lard, canned meat, sugar. The transition was framed as assistance, as modernization, as benevolence. But the knowledge of how to find, prepare, and enjoy insect foods depends on transmission, on elders showing children where to look, how to listen, what to taste. When that transmission breaks, the knowledge doesn't just fade, it evaporates. An elder in Arizona recalled in an oral history project from the 1970s that her grandmother used to roast cicadas in hot sand and grind them into flour for cakes, and that she herself had watched the process as a child but had never done it, and that her grandchildren did not know the word for cicada in their own language. 3 generations, and a cuisine vanished. Not banned, not burned, not criminalized, simply interrupted. The silence where a recipe used to live is heavier than any prohibition, because there is no authority to defy, no law to repeal. There is only absence and the slow realization that something irreplaceable was traded for something forgettable. But here is where the story pivots, because the exception is ending, and you are watching it happen in real time. The global insect food market was valued at roughly $1 billion in 2023 and is projected to triple within a decade, driven not by nostalgia but by arithmetic. Raising crickets requires 12 times less feed than cattle to produce equivalent protein, uses a fraction of the water, emits negligible greenhouse gases, and can be farmed vertically in urban warehouses on food waste that would otherwise rot in landfills. These are not speculative claims. They are measured, replicated, published in peer-reviewed journals that your government agencies cite in their own sustainability reports. The FAO has been publishing comprehensive assessments of edible insects since 2013, and their tone has shifted from cautious curiosity to urgent advocacy as climate models worsen. The science is settled. The question is whether culture can catch up, and it is catching up, in ways that would have made Vincent Holt weep with vindication. In Bangkok, street vendors sell deep-fried scorpions and silk pupa to tourists and locals alike, and the tourist gaze that once treated these foods as daredevil novelties is gradually giving way to genuine appreciation. In Oaxaca, restaurants serving chapulines and escamoles command Michelin attention and international reservations, reframing ingredients that were stigmatized as poverty food into markers of regional identity and culinary excellence. In the Netherlands, Wageningen University runs dedicated research programs on insect protein extraction, and Dutch supermarkets began stocking insect-based products in the 2000s, normalizing them through packaging design and placement rather than novelty marketing. In the United States, companies like Exo and Chapel produce protein bars and flours that deliberately obscure the insect origin, meeting consumers where their comfort currently lives, while building supply chains that will eventually make transparency possible. The strategy is pragmatic. Hide the form, deliver the function, let familiarity precede acceptance. It is not romantic, but romance never fed anyone. Infrastructure feeds people. There is also a generational shift happening that no amount of marketing could manufacture. Children in Western countries who grow up with insect-based snacks in school lunch programs, who encounter them in science museums and nature centers and YouTube videos exactly like this one, are developing palates that their parents cannot access. Research from Belgium and Finland shows that repeated exposure in neutral or positive contexts reduces disgust responses in children far more effectively than persuasion or information alone. A 7-year-old who has eaten cricket flour cookies at a birthday party does not need to be convinced that insects are sustainable. She already knows they are delicious. The disgust was always learned, and learning works in both directions. Give it a generation, maybe 2, and the revulsion that feels eternal right now will seem as quaint and inexplicable as the Victorian horror at women wearing trousers. Consider the numbers that your body already understands, even if your mind resists them. 2 billion people currently eat insects regularly, across every continent except Antarctica. That is not a niche. That is a quarter of humanity maintaining a practice that your culture temporarily abandoned. Over 1,900 species of insects have been documented as human food, representing orders from Coleoptera to Hymenoptera to Lepidoptera, each with distinct flavors, textures, nutritional profiles, and cultural associations. The diversity dwarfs that of conventional livestock. We farm perhaps 5 mammal species at scale, while insect cuisines draw from hundreds. A single hectare of land can produce 30 tons of insect protein annually, compared to less than 1 ton of beef. If you replace just 10% of global animal protein production with insect protein, you would free up agricultural land equivalent to the size of France, reduce freshwater withdrawals by billions of cubic meters, and cut food system emissions by a measurable percentage of the total. These are not fantasies, they are conversions, straightforward substitutions that require only willingness. And willingness is arriving, carried by bodies that care less about categories than consequences. Athletes seeking complete proteins without environmental guilt. Parents wanting to feed children responsibly without sacrificing joy. Chefs chasing umami compounds that glutamate alone cannot provide. Preppers stocking shelf-stable nutrition that lasts decades without refrigeration. Space agencies designing closed-loop life support systems where insects convert astronaut waste into edible biomass. NASA has funded research into insect bioreactors for Mars missions because when you are 40 million miles from the nearest cow, efficiency stops being theoretical and starts being existential. The International Space Station has already tested insect cultivation modules. Your descendants may eat bugs not because they chose to, but because the alternative is starvation in vacuum. The cosmos does not care about your feelings. It cares about mass balance. There is also fraud, because wherever value accumulates, deception follows. In China, counterfeit cordyceps, caterpillar fungus prized in traditional medicine and increasingly marketed as superfood, are carved from dough, dyed, and sold at premium prices to buyers who cannot distinguish authentic specimens from skilled imitations. In Mexico, unscrupulous vendors mix cheaper caterpillar species with genuine escamoles, exploiting the visual similarity and the buyer's lack of taxonomic expertise. In Europe, insect protein powders have been adulterated with soy or whey to stretch supply and reduce costs, undermining consumer trust in a category that cannot afford skepticism. These are growing pains, identical to those experienced by olive oil, honey, saffron, and every other high-value food that outpaced its regulatory framework. The solution is not prohibition. It is standardization, testing, labeling, the boring institutional work that makes markets honest. Fraud proves demand. Demand builds infrastructure. Infrastructure enables integrity. The cycle is predictable, and we are exactly where we should expect to be. Your own body is already participating in this return, whether you acknowledge it or not. Carmine, the red dye in yogurt, candy, cosmetics, and pharmaceuticals, is extracted from cochineal insects, and you have consumed it thousands of times without knowing. Shellac, the glossy coating on pills and confections, comes from lac beetles. Honey is insect regurgitation. Beeswax wraps your cheese. Silk threads your clothing. You are already entomophagic, metabolically and materially integrated with insect bodies in ways that precede consent and exceed awareness. The boundary you drew between acceptable and unacceptable insect products was always arbitrary, always porous, always violated by the very industries that assured you it was solid. Acknowledging this does not collapse the distinction. It reveals that the distinction was maintained by ignorance, not principle. Knowledge changes the texture of consumption. Once you see the insect in the dye, you cannot unsee it. And that seeing is the beginning of a different relationship, one based on recognition rather than denial. So return now to that opening image. You, in your climate-controlled room, staring at a plate of insects and feeling something ancient and manufactured rise in your throat. That feeling is real. Honor it. Then ask where it came from, who benefits from its persistence, and what it costs you to maintain it. The answer is not that you should force yourself to eat bugs tomorrow morning, performing bravery for an audience of none. The answer is that the feeling is temporary, contingent, already dissolving at the edges as new generations learn new vocabularies of taste. Your disgust is a historical artifact, and artifacts belong in museums, not in mouths. Somewhere in Oaxaca, a grandmother is teaching her granddaughter to toast chapulines on a comal, passing down a technique that survived conquest, colonization, industrialization, and shame. Somewhere in Wageningen, A researcher is optimizing feed conversion ratios for black soldier fly larvae that will become protein isolate in a product you will buy next year without recognizing its origin. Somewhere in orbit, an astronaut is checking the humidity levels in an insect bioreactor that will determine whether humans can live permanently off-world. And somewhere in your own kitchen, tonight or next month or next decade, you will pick up something small and unfamiliar and put it in your mouth. And the feeling that rises will not be disgust, but curiosity. And that curiosity will be the oldest thing you have ever tasted. If this journey from Cathedral to Cosmos landed somewhere unexpected, pick your next step from 3 concrete moments buried in what you just heard. First, the horror. The unnamed woman in Limpopo, standing in a mopane grove she was legally forbidden to harvest, watching our community's protein source become state property while her children went hungry. Not because the worms disappeared, but because paperwork said they should. Second, the absurd brilliance. Vincent Holt, in 1885, passionately recommending slug soup to Victorian gentlemen who would rather starve than admit a bug might be delicious, failing completely and correctly at the same time. Third, the modern frontier. NASA engineers designing insect bioreactors for Mars habitats. Because when you're colonizing another planet, your squeamishness weighs too much to carry. Choose whichever of those 3 pulled something loose in you. Drop it in the comments below and tell me why that particular moment caught. Next week, we tackle another food taboo that feels eternal but isn't, and you'll want to be subscribed when that paradox drops. Until then, stay curious, stay hungry, and remember that every disgust you feel is a story waiting to be unwritten.